America first is not America alone, and it's certainly not isolationism. I hear that often. That's often a criticism of not only AFPI, but this America First movement. People say, well, you just want to put your head in the sand and go away, and that's simply not the case. I have seen where development dollars and development resources have been used effectively to advance American interest. And the U.S. has to be there, and it can't be solved with our military all the time. It's solved with that soft diplomacy, development dollars, engagement, but you've got to be there on the ground doing it day in and day out.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. All right, this is a lot of pressure because this is about coffee break time. So I hope you all got your caffeine before we came in, but I think this is gonna be a really robust and riveting conversation, so we're glad you're here. And Secretary Wolf, welcome.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you here on the stage. And as always, thanks to our good friend, Senator Norm Coleman, for his support. So let's dive in. I am going to start by addressing the elephant in the room. And that is definitely a pun intended for our other Republican friends here. Thank you. I needed at least a chuckle, so I know you're with me. But really want to talk about this. So you are here on stage. We've got all the signage. You're being hosted by the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. And you are executive director at an organization with America First in the name. So let's start out with this. I want to really get into what America First means. You will not be surprised to this, but it means a lot of different things to a lot of people, right? Sure. There are some who say, okay, America first is America alone, is isolationism. And you and AFPI, I should mention, you look at it very differently. And in fact, you define it as foreign policy engagement in the American interest. And I should note, as everyone knows, you had a front row seat in the previous administration, in the Trump administration. And so you really got to see this idea of America first in action. And so I just want to ask you, let's start the conversation by this. What is the actual true definition of America first? And describe what that means on a global stage.
Well, sure. Well, again, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I think, what we do every day at the America First Policy Institute is we tackle a number of hard public policy decisions to include national security, what we're talking about here today, and our role internationally, but we approach that from a little different perspective. Is what's in the best interest of everyday Americans in making a lot of these hard decisions. And so when you look at national security and you look at entanglements overseas and you look at different priorities from a development standpoint, sort of what we always come back to is how do these decisions affect everyday Americans? How does it affect my mother in Mississippi and others out there? And what's in their best interest? Now, sometimes that can be very clear and very straightforward, and sometimes it's not as clear. So again, America first is not America alone, and it's certainly not isolationism. I hear that often. That's often a criticism of not only AFPI, but this America First movement. People say, well, you just want to put your head in the sand and go away. And that's simply not the case. It's certainly not how President Trump governed for 4 years and his national security team around him. It's not how they operated, right? And so when you look at a variety of different things and the successes that you had, you've got to start this America First approach, and we'll talk a little bit about this later probably, is what does that look from a leadership perspective? So leadership matters, but also being strong at home matters, right? The strength of the United States is not our great diplomats and others, it's our economy, it's the ability to be energy independent, it's our safe communities, it's our secure borders. And if you're out, if you're overseas and you are engaging with the rest of the world from a position of strength, that's what we talk about being America first. And so I think that's really, really important. We saw that during 4 years of the Trump administration. But you also look at some of the successes, obviously. The Abraham Accords, I think, were historic. Defeating ISIS, obviously, is a very big deal. Engagement with the North Korean leader, historic, meetings that occurred there. This is about engaging the international community, but doing so on your terms and with your priorities in mind, and certainly as it relates to NATO, making sure that that organization is actually investing in European security to the level that they can. These are all things that were that President Trump obviously pushed forward during the administration, and many others. And so Again, the idea here that it's somehow bury your head in the sand and you're only about what occurs within the borders of our country is simply not the case. I think it's about international engagement. It's about that international community, but I think where we differ is how do you do that and what should the priorities be and what's the approach? And sometimes you gotta go to uncomfortable situations and have uncomfortable discussions. And we did that quite often during the Trump administration, but I think that's what the American people want out of their government is let's start having government, whether it's here in the US or overseas, the resources, our treasure that we send overseas, how is it benefiting everyday Americans? And that's sort of where we come at it from.
Well, it's so interesting because I think that really reflects a lot when we're talking to our leaders in our states, right? USGLC has chapters all across the country, and it is similar, right? Because we're always trying to make global issues local,
Yep.
right? And the easiest way, I think, to do that and the most efficient is what is that direct correlation, to your point, to your mother in Mississippi,
Yep.
to my dad who's a soybean farmer in Iowa, right? What is that return on the investment? What's that correlation?
Yep.
So let's take this a little farther. And while I should note, America First Policy Institute is not the next administration in waiting. Technically, you are led by many people who did have policy experience and were leaders in the Trump administration. And I note that because you are out with a new book called An American First Approach to U.S. National Security. You, of course, are one
Yep.
of the authors. And so I want to dig into that a little bit and talk about the content. Because the book does provide details on what the next America First administration should do to rebuild America's strength on the global stage and the restoration of peace and stability around the world. And I thought it was interesting because when you're talking about national security in the book, you make it clear that national security is not just about having a strong military.
Yeah.
It's also about how do we have a strategy for using all of our tools, right? The soft power tools as well to protect our citizens. So while I respect, you don't currently speak for the president, no one does, or for his policies, could you share with us, based on your experience, based on the thoughts you put in the book, what would you anticipate the priorities, the next foreign policy priorities of an America First administration to look like? And then I'm going to follow on, can you tease out a little bit more when you're talking about the non-military tools in our national security, like diplomacy, like economic development? How do you see that playing as part of the strategy?
Sure. Well, let me reiterate, and I appreciate you bringing it up for those of you on the camera and elsewhere. I do not speak for the president. He does or former president. He does a pretty good job speaking for himself. Nor do I speak for the campaign, not affiliated. So my views are that of the America First Policy Institute. Now, yes, we have 9 former cabinet members and others that served in the administration. So we have a pretty good idea of that America First approach to not only this issue, but other issues that we face. Look, I think the next America First administration, when it comes to national security and diplomacy around the globe, I think there's 5 areas that I think are going to be, hit them on day one. One is our borders. I think President Trump changed the dynamic. In my lifetime, and I had the bio here, and I've been in DC probably too long. When you talk about national security, it almost always starts with the conversation about overseas events and how those events are impacting national security. And I think that's an okay conversation and debate to have. I think one thing that the Trump administration decided to change a little bit is actually let's start talking about the sovereignty of our borders and the security of our borders. So when I talk about national security, the safety, the security of Americans start with our borders. So getting the current historic border crisis under control, I think, is priority number one. And it's not only, you can talk about asylum and you can talk about all these immigration terms, which I'm happy to do. But I think when you just look at the national security threats, when you look at the public safety threats that are emanating from what's occurring along that border, as an American, you have to care about that. You have to care about the hundreds of thousands or 100,000 Americans that are dying every year from fentanyl, the poisoning, and that's largely almost 90% coming across that southern border by the cartels. So border security is obviously a big component, I think, of a national security issue that's gonna face the new administration first and foremost. I think a military readiness I think rebuilding our military one way or another is something that the folks that will eventually serve at the DoD and in the Pentagon and elsewhere are going to have to get their hands around. I think there's a historic recruitment, retention issue going on in all of our armed forces. And I think, look, that can be contributed to a variety of different issues at play here. I think a large part of it is politicizing our armed forces. The COVID vaccine mandate it played a part in that. We had over 8,000 service members that were dismissed from the military, have not come back. Now that's a relatively small number when you look at it overall, but that has a lingering effect that you've got to deal with. And then when you look at some of the other issues that they're dealing with there, and you look at some of the divisive DEI requirements and others that are being imposed on the military, I think that's something that an America First administration will have to deal with. And then the three other areas, I would say, two involve a hot war, one involves more of a strategic war. Obviously, I'm talking about Ukraine, Israel, and then China. And I think those are three areas that any incoming America First administration is going to have to deal with, and is going to have to put that peace through strength test, right? That approach to the test when it comes to all of those. Obviously, the situation with the CCP is a little different. That's more of a long-term challenge that we have for our national security, and it demands different solutions. But when we talk about leadership and we talk about that America First, is how do you get the situation in Ukraine, obviously in Israel, two different conflicts that are ongoing, but how do you address those? So I think those 5 areas are something that any national security team that's coming in, hopefully will be coming in, is going to have to take a hard look at.
And just to build on that, because these are big issues, and you have outlined some really heady areas of national security. I mean, do you see how we can better utilize some of those soft power tools in that? I think of our National Security Advisory Council, who are all former 3- and 4-star generals. Many of you are here with us today, thanks. We have a lot of conversations about the fact that by the time the military has to come in, right, it's almost too late. And are there better areas where we can, utilize prevention?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is about that bold diplomacy, right? How do you execute that? And again, I think that comes, I talked about it a little bit earlier, that comes from a position of strength. It's hard to do that if folks around the world do not respect you. It's hard to do that around the world if you draw bright lines and then you go past those, or I should say our adversaries go past those, and no one's holding them accountable, then your words start to fall on deaf ears. And I think that's what we've seen over the last couple of years. And I think if you contrast that with that bold leadership, and then knowing that deterrence is there because you're going to hold individuals accountable. So that's before the military, the armed forces even get involved, right?
Sure.
Of course, you have to be willing to use them in certain instances. You don't want to. And then there's the development side and how you use development dollars, development resources in the most strategic way, but then also beneficial to the American people. And I dealt with that at DHS. Obviously we were dealing with a number of immigration and border crisis and other things that we were doing with folks in Mexico, but also Central America and a little bit in South America. And we used development dollars. And what I found, it may not be the case everywhere across the world, is it was very transactional. That we get what we would need if they got what they need. And that was the relationship, particularly with Mexico, a little less with some of the others. But providing dollars after dollars after dollars, which I think folks, at least that are on my side and conservatives, saying, hey, we need to stop this foreign aid because it just goes into a black hole. We don't see any benefits. And what are we getting when we've got problems here at home? I understand that. I sympathize with that, and I think there's a big element of that you've got to address. But I have seen where development dollars and development resources have been used effectively to advance American interest. I think you got to be clear with the American people about that, and so that they understand that. So when they see millions of dollars go into a foreign government that they may not even can point out on a map, that they know that that's being used for a very specific purpose to get a very specific result for the American people.
No, I think that's such a great point, and it drives so much of what we do at USGLC with our advocacy. To your point, to help the taxpayer understand, where is this money being invested? What does that look like? What's the return we get? And we know there is a market return. You said one of my buzzwords, you said China. So I got to ask about
big
China.
Buzzword.
It is. I don't know if buzzword is right, but we're going to talk about China. So you have said before, and I'm quoting you, the most long-term strategic threat to Americans, the homeland, and our way of life is the threat from China. And I think many people agree with that, and I think it's easy to see why.
Yep.
If you look across the world right now, right, China has actually more diplomatic posts than we do. Across the world. They have also increased in the last 15 years their development investments by 525%. And increasingly, we're looking at the trade component, of course, and right now, China is the top #1 trading partner of 120 countries around the world. And so, President Trump in the first administration really spent a lot of time talking about and unveiling how the United States, how the administration was going to address this challenge. And I always think it's important, there was a lot of really great groundbreaking, I would say, initiatives specifically in that development space that offered a really credible alternative, right, to the CCP's influence and instruments. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, DFC, you've heard from them earlier today, which really modernized, right, how we're investing across the world and trying to really show that we can be that better partner and option than China. The Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, something I was really proud to work on, which really looked at how do we invest in women overseas, right? Knowing that women, when you invest in women, right, you see a really marked return on the stability and prosperity of a country. And then finally, getting to your point about foreign assistance, right? Under the administration, there was the piloting of this new approach to modernizing foreign assistance called the Journey to Self-Reliance. And it really got to the point you just made, right? Let's really rethink our strategies and our partnerships and our policies so that the dollars we're investing, right, in foreign assistance, right, really lead to increased outcomes, right, in the end of needing to do so. And then lastly, I'll say, because we have so many private sector partners in our coalition, I think there was such great progress in sitting back and better saying, where does the private sector come in? And how do we as the US government sometimes step back and say, how do we harness the private sector, the ingenuity, the innovation, the financing, right, to meet these goals? So on that note, knowing that so much was done and piloted, again, if you had to put, your sort of pull out your crystal ball, how do you think a second Trump administration would build on those successes and really, employ all of our tools to compete with China, not only from a national security aspect, but economically?
Yeah. So let me reiterate again, I don't speak for the president or the former president. Let me make that abundantly clear. Look, I think I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. I think China, as I said in a 2020 threat assessment that I issued at the time from the Department of Homeland Security, is the #1 existential threat to the United States. They're here in the United States, they're overseas, they're everywhere. Their ability to try to defeat the United States is very different than in Iran, even Russia, and others. And it's the most, sort of day in and day out, I think it's the one thing that most Americans need to keep an eye on. It's also probably one of the most difficult things, because if you're every day living your life in America and you're not listening to this or others, you may not see China, right? Yes, you may see TikTok and you may see a couple of things that are owned by the Chinese, but are you seeing that ag land being bought up by the CCP and others? Are you seeing the infiltration of universities and even, I would say, primary educational institutions being influenced by the CCP? Probably not if you're not looking for it. So look, I think our #1 greatest threat, and again, I give President Trump a lot of credit for this. I think if you were to go back 2014, 15, 16, we were talking about China and the CCP as a competitor. Right now, I think the right term is an adversary. And it's not like you need to go to war with them, but you need to start treating them in a different way and in a different environment. And again, I give the previous administration a lot of credit for doing that. So what does that mean? There's a couple of really easy things I can say that are really, really difficult to do, right? Decoupling ourselves from that supply chain that originates in China and elsewhere. Obviously, we saw it during COVID, that medical supply chain, but pharmaceutical and otherwise. I think we need to obviously rebuild our military and our military alliances to confront that Chinese ambition and aggression on a variety of different fronts. They are making they have more shipbuilding capacity than we do at the moment. They have more polar icebreakers than we do at the moment. They're not even a polar nation. And so you really got to think, where are their investments to where the United States is investing? Trade practices, obviously, is something that President Trump and Ambassador Lighthizer, I think, made a lot of great progress on. I think if he ends up winning and you see a second term, I think he's going to continue to build on all of these, including trade practices. There's something that we talk about at AFPI a lot. I know Ambassador Lighthizer does, and it's called reciprocity. And it's this idea that we allow China and Chinese entities to do certain things here in the United States that they would never allow US entities to do in China. Whether we're talking about student visas, we're talking about buying land and ownership in companies and the like. And we need to start to wake up to that. Otherwise, that's going to come back to bite us, and I think it already has. So I think all of those things are issues that we've got to confront. China, we can talk Belt and Road. We can talk about a variety of initiatives that I saw traveling around the world as well. When they're giving out money, they'll say they're giving it out, it's a loan, and what it does to developing nations. And the U.S. has to be there. We've got to be present for those debates, and it's difficult. And it can't be solved with our military all the time. It's solved with that soft diplomacy, development dollars, engagement, but you've got to be there on the ground doing it day in and day out.
No, I couldn't agree more, and I know it always gives me great pride when you can go to a country and you can see that U.S. private sector investments happening, right? And I'm always struck by when you go to these countries too, right? There is still the American dream, right? They want to partner with us, and I really appreciate your point but we have to be there. So in closing, first of all, I want to say thank you for your long-term public service, and you've had some heady positions. You've dealt with everything from terrorism to border security, and your work has brought you all across the world. So in closing, I just want to talk a little bit about that sort of positive ending, right? Which is, I still believe in the power of America as a force for good. I know you do, or you wouldn't be in the line of work that you're in. So I'm just curious if we can make it really personal here, and you can sort of share with us here in the audience what, I guess I would coin, what was your aha moment? In all of these years of public service dealing with these really tricky issues, right? What was that moment where you kind of step back and realize what it's worth, to you personally, to our citizens, for America to be engaged out there in the world?
Well, that's a tough one. I served all 4 years during the Trump administration, served in the Bush administration at a much junior level. And so this idea of service, you served, others here have served, and if you haven't, you're in the private sector and you're contributing to the mission. So I think there's just something about innate inside most people about giving back to the country, greatest country on earth, one way or another. For me, probably a couple of different instances kind of come to mind on what is the role of the U.S. government around the world, and particularly at DHS, I saw that where, I came in early 17, day one in 17, and had a certain experience level, but then that grew over the course of a couple of different years, and I understood how the department really relied on our international partners to make sure that we were securing the homeland here at home. What we could do overseas, particularly at that time, if you think back in 16, 17, making sure that you didn't have enemy combatants coming back from the battlefield, coming back into Western Europe, and then coming into the U.S. How we were working, how we were vetting, how we were doing all of those different things, and it started to click in my mind like this is what securing the homeland really means. It's working with our international partners. Yes, it's about securing the borders, and we can do more and better of that, but it's also how are we projected overseas. And so when I would travel internationally and was curious, I got different receptions from different people, depending on if they liked our policies or they didn't. Some good stories there. But I think it was all very interesting. And then just personally, there's always that one moment or two where you always question and you say, is it worth it? Right? Because people that serve in public service, and thank you to everyone who does or serves in the military, there is a price to pay on the home front. On birthdays that get missed or holidays or different sacrifices. And I remember a period of time, and this just tells you the kind of environment that we now find ourselves in 2020, where my house was protested day in and day out, almost every weekend. And my kids, who were 12 and 13 at the time, had no idea what was going on. All they knew was people hated their dad. And so people, around the neighborhood and others would be like, oh, this is really terrible. You've got to, you need to find a new job, right? And for me, it actually did the opposite. I said, nope, I'm doubling down now. Because, look, if someone's in front of my house protesting, it usually means I'm doing something right, not something wrong. So that was one moment. I have others, but it showed me that there are some things that are worth fighting for, and not everyone agrees, and it seems like 50% will agree and 50% won't. But if you have a good moral compass and you know what the right thing is that you're doing for the right reasons, then you just got to blaze that. So that would be one aha moment.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for your service, and thanks for your candid insights today. We really appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.